Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And we are rejoined by our returning champion, Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is my guest. You all know him, independent journalist, compassionate gentleman. Many of you know him as a correspondent for the Real News Network. He's an environmentalist, an eco-socialist, and an activist. Involved in people power movements, lawyer based in Montreal, and a member and founder of Green Left Canada. And he was a strong leadership contender for the Green Party of Canada. And just before I get to my questions, Dimitri's here because to also celebrate the fact that One Plus One recently had its 100th 100th episode. Yves Engler was supposed to join us tonight, but he got last minute change of plans forced him to have to cancel. So before I get to my questions, I just want to thank Dimitri. I want to thank you, Yves Engler, Margaret Kimberley of Black Agenda Report, Rick Sterling, Alfred De Zayas, Jay Watts, the Communist Party of Canada, Boyan and Maria of the Barricade, Arnold August, Aidan, Jonah, the fantastic duo of Red Light Podcast, Jacob of Propaganda, and all of our guests, the ones who've only come on once, and the ones who like Dimitri have come on repeatedly. Because without them, we would not have One Plus One. And a special thank you to Solomon Commisong of Your World News and Trish of Faint Signals for Vega for all of their support when there was times I, even doubted whether to continue doing One Plus One. So, Dimitri.
First of all, congratulations, Youri, on your 100th episode. That's a fantastic accomplishment. There's so many people out there trying to, make podcasts work. And people like yourself are operating obviously in a very challenging environment because, you're trying to get access to platforms where you can reach a large segment of the public. And the odds are stacked against people like yourself who are doing, as you put it, inconvenient truth telling, and discussing the issues in a way that the elites don't want them to be discussed. So you're operating in a very challenging environment. Anybody who gets to 100 episodes deserves a big round of applause, and I'm happy
although I still wish I had as much views as your colleagues at the Real News Network or Paul J of Analysis.news, or even Jimmy Dore, some friends of mine, and in fact even a past guest on the program, Chris Williamson, when I was he was giving me encouragement that keep doing what you're doing, because it's like planting a garden. It takes a long time for it to bloom, but it'll all work out. So thanks for always being a returning champion on the program.
Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
All right, Dimitri, and always an honor to have you. All right, Dimitri, because we're under strict time, let's get right into let's get right into the topics. So, Dimitri, what was your overall impression on the recent general election in Canada that saw the Liberal Party return to power? It is still a minority government, although the Liberals increased their seats. And I'll just say the following: what I said to Yves Engler yesterday. I was hoping the electorate would have punished Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party more, and it would have been nice to have seen more NDPs and Greens, and heck, even some communists, in Parliament, because I think that more or less represents a lot of the views of Canadians and people power movements. But that didn't happen. But luckily, the Conservative Party did not have a comeback. Luckily, the People's Party of Canada did not gain any seats, and I thought that would have been the worst case scenario, especially with all of the misplaced anger that's been happening with the ongoing coronavirus crisis.
Yeah.
And all of that, and of course there were a lot of anti-lockdown protests, lots of anti-mask protests, and anti-vax protests, which I'm curious your thoughts on. But what's your overall response to the to the last general election that happened in Canada?
Well, it's the election that changed nothing. It's precisely what it is. The seat count, as you noted, really was remarkably similar at the end of the day. Any gains or losses suffered were slight, and that really is true of all the parties. But it really wasn't the fact that the configuration of Parliament changed so little. And by that, I mean the distribution of seats. That's not the main reason that I call it the election that changed nothing. The main reason I call it the election that changed nothing is that the political discourse continued to operate within a suffocatingly narrow margin in this country. So many issues of primordial importance, some of a very practical nature, some of a human rights nature and socioeconomic nature, just got completely ignored or discussed in the most perfunctory and shallow way. So for example, I could just, there's so much, Youri, I could try to just give you a few examples. We have UBS put out a report, a global bank, a few days ago on the condition of real estate markets in the world. And it identified 9 major global cities as being in a real estate bubble. 2 of them are in Canada. Canada's first and third largest cities, Toronto and Vancouver. And then, the stock, so we are, and if you look at the historical data relating to property values versus income, we are in Canada in a much worse place than the United States was just before the financial crisis. And we're seeing a very similar process play out within the stock markets. I just noted today on Twitter that within the last 20 months, less than 20 months, the Toronto Stock Exchange, the biggest mining exchange in the world, the main stock exchange in Canada by far, has risen 80% in 20 months. It has repeatedly reached record highs in the last few weeks. And this is happening despite the fact that inflation in the prior month was at the highest level in almost 20 years. We're seeing disruptions in the supply chain. There's an international energy crunch. The climate crisis is spinning out of control. We're not by any means out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic. How is it that the stock market is repeatedly hitting record highs and has gone up 80% since, I think, March of 2020? It makes absolutely no sense. Various asset classes are in bubble territory, and this is just a disaster waiting to happen. There was no discussion about this at all. There was a little bit of discussion about the fact that a lot of Canadians can't afford to buy a house anymore, but no real analysis of the larger deficiencies and distortions in stock markets and property markets and other asset classes. So that's one example. Another example is there was absolutely no discussion about military spending being too high. To the extent that it was discussed at all, what the question was, are we spending enough? Right? Nobody out there saying, not one leader in Parliament saying, maybe we're spending way too much money on the military. Nobody was questioning whether we should be in NATO anymore. That's a taboo. You can't even have that discussion in our country. Nobody talked about the fact that Canada continues to trade in arms with the world's most egregious human rights violators, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, which I would go so far as to say may have caused the deaths of more innocent civilians than any other country in the world in the post-World War II period. It is, by that measure, arguably the worst human rights violator in the last 75 years. This is our closest ally, and we just continue to do its bidding. We sent a warship through the Taiwan Strait the other day, along with an American warship. Why were we doing that? How is that actually defending our country? Sending a warship between the waters separating Taiwan and China, mainland China, at a time when there is extraordinary tension between the two. These things don't even get discussed in our country. So from my perspective, it was the election that changed absolutely nothing in terms of political discourse. And if we don't start having these conversations, which you keep, generating on your program and other left-wing podcasters and YouTubers are doing, if we don't have those discussions, in mainstream politics, we're not going to solve a damn thing. And we're
Yeah.
just going to find ourselves in a worse and worse place from a democratic and environmental perspective.
Very briefly, how would you assess the federal government's response to the ongoing coronavirus crisis, and what would you have advocated, and like-minded folks, the response to coronavirus? I should add, I normally try to avoid talking about the coronavirus because it's bizarrely become like a polarizing toxic subject, which even much of the left is at each other's throats on coronavirus. So
Yeah.
so putting aside what were the origins, and and people who are COVID minimalists, and some are even COVID denialists. So putting all that aside and just saying, okay, we are dealing with a pandemic. Uh, yeah, how would you have assessed the federal government's response to the ongoing coronavirus crisis, and what would you have advocated that the federal government and the provisional ones should have done in response to this pandemic?
Well, from a purely domestic perspective, the government did a pretty good job of securing vaccine supplies and distributing the vaccines, across the country, and encouraging people, making them accessible, encouraging people to take the vaccines. But really, it was already in a very advantageous position in that regard, because Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So it was able to pony up billions of dollars right out of the gate in order to purchase large supplies of vaccines. When you look at the government's response, because the way our government deals with this issue is not something that has purely domestic repercussions, it has international repercussions as well. While, it's been effectively hoarding vaccines, it's done almost nothing to help the countries that can't afford to buy them. And in that regard, it deserves to be fiercely criticized. Canada is a full-fledged participant in the global regime of vaccine apartheid. And this is not just inhumane, it's not just immoral, but it also is bad science, because as long as you have huge swaths of the world that are largely unvaccinated, variants could very well emerge, and already have started to emerge, that render the existing vaccine supply less efficient, or in a nightmare scenario, effectively useless. So it's done a terrible job of helping to distribute vaccines to countries that urgently need those vaccines. It did provide, reasonable levels of support in terms of economic support to people who were adversely affected by the lockdowns, but it didn't learn the lessons. It didn't learn the lesson, and by no means perfect support, but it was reasonable.
Yeah.
However, it hasn't learned the lessons from that. The programs that were put in place, something we call the CERB, which was basically a temporary guaranteed income, that should have been made permanent.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and should have been increased and made permanent. And that would be the surest way, in my opinion, to eliminate poverty in this country. There's no excuse for having millions of Canadians living in poverty. Like I said, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So the country's winding down, the government's winding that program down, when it should be doing the opposite. It should be bolstering the program and making the program permanent. And I have to say one other thing, I'm glad you raised the issue of the toxicity of, COVID-19 debate. Look, I'm fully vaccinated. My partner's fully vaccinated. My 2 adult children are fully vaccinated. I encourage people in my own family, and some of them are anti-vaxxers, to get vaccinated.
Yeah,
but
I also have friends and comrades and peoples who are like that.
Yeah, and I've lots of people who had met me through politics are espouse an anti-vax point of view. As I said, people in my extended family, quite a few of them, frankly. And I always, take the position, I think that this is the right thing to do, but really I cannot abide the censorship to which they're being subjected. I think that that's absolutely wrong. I'm just, as a general matter, I'm opposed to censorship in all but the most extreme cases. And in this particular context, it's actually backfiring, because if people, when people see, especially people who are kind of on the fence, they don't know what to believe in terms of, vaccine mandates, lockdowns, and so forth, what they're hearing about COVID, the level of mortality and everything. People are on the fence and are not sure what to make of it all. When they see us censoring those who are opposed to these things, I think that raises a strong instinct of suspicion in them. And they're like, well, if you have the evidence on your side and you're able to win the debate, then why don't you just debate these people? Why are you silencing them? Why are you vilifying them? So I think that's actually counterproductive to censor people, and it's just wrong. So I don't think that, and a lot of the people who are opposed to vaccines, whether they're misinformed or not, they view it as a decision they're making about their own health. It's not like they're out there trying to hurt people. That's not their objective. They've become convinced, rightly or wrongly, that taking the vaccines are either unnecessary or place themselves at risk. So what I guess
and there
what I'm
are
trying to say is,
concerns.
yeah,
There are legitimate
absolutely,
concerns because of Big Pharma's bad track record.
Absolutely.
Bad track record and whatnot.
You can't blame people for distrusting Big Pharma. I mean, come on. Big Pharma has lied its way to profitability again and again and again. And we've also seen that, the regulatory community, not just in the pharmaceutical industry, but elsewhere, has become increasingly captured by the regulated, by the industries that are supposed to be, supervised by these regulators. So there are real legitimate reasons why people are skeptical. Even if they're wrong, and I do believe they're wrong, we should engage them in a respectful debate and stop shutting them down and treating them like freaks. A lot of them are not freaks. They're just ordinary Canadians, citizens from other countries who have a suspicion and a level of concern that should be addressed.
And one of these days, well, maybe one of these days, maybe we'll, maybe I'll do, an entire program on coronavirus and how we overcome the extreme polarization that's come with it. But on to the next one, which is now I spoke with Yves Engler twice, and yesterday on on the program, he told me that many on the left engaged in tactical voting the last general election. That is something I strongly disapprove of, and I know both you and past guests on this program, Barry Weisletter of the NDP Socialist Caucus and Socialist Action Canada, also disapprove of tactical voting. And can you briefly make the case why those involved in our people power movements shouldn't do something I believe is counterproductive, which is tactical voting, regardless of whether the NDP and the Greens are not the best flaming left-wing parties that we want them to be.
Yeah. Well, first, for so many reasons, Youri. First off, the differences between the two parties that have dominated politics in this country federally for the entire post-World War II period are far lesser than we are led to believe. So they are largely in agreement on 90% of the issues that matter to people. Okay.
Exactly.
When it comes to tax havens and tax rates, and when it comes to military policy and defense spending and health spending and on and on and on.
Settler colonialism and imperialism.
Absolutely. There's almost complete disagreement. A complete agreement, almost 100% agreement on foreign policy between the two major parties. Of course, they'll never admit that. That's why they don't talk about it. That's why they don't debate it, because it would become immediately apparent that they are entirely in agreement. There's so many issues like that. So people who vote strategically, they go to the Liberals, to prevent a conservative government instead of voting for the NDP or the Greens or some other party of the left. All they're doing is ensuring that the duopoly remains in power. That's all they're doing. And the Liberal Party, if they can count on, a significant segment of the population switching its vote at the last minute every election to prevent a conservative government from coming to power, they're going to take those voters for granted. It's like, they don't have to do anything to satisfy them except say, well, if you don't vote for us, you're going to get stuck with a conservative government. If you want to move the Liberal Party to the left, then you have to impose consequences on the Liberal Party when they don't adopt progressive policies, or when they say they will adopt them and turn out to be liars, as they have again and again and again. They have no incentive to change. Exactly. In a system in which strategic voting is rampant. So, I could say other things, but those really are the two main reasons. And I understand why people do it. I get it. It is true that in some respects, the conservatives are slightly worse than the liberals, but I think you have to take a longer term view of this and see how strategic voting is impacting our country politically on a long-term basis. And the results are overwhelmingly negative for our democracy on a long-term basis.
I completely agree with you on that. And one of these days we're going to have to, that's another topic that one of these days we're going to have to debate with someone on the Canadian left who engage in tactical voting, which I I think it's not only counterproductive, it's also counter revolutionary.
Yeah,
Now,
well said.
now let's talk about before we run out of time, let's talk about your party, the Green Party. What were some of the policy proposals that the Greens advocated, which I have to say, sadly, got overlooked by that sadly got overlooked.
Right. Well, we're kind of in a gray zone in terms of our policy development process. Well, we were at the time that the election happened, because we had conducted an online preliminary vote, the Green Party members, on a slate of very progressive policy proposals. But that's only the first step, and the conclusion to that process will happen after the election. So we saw a number of really progressive policies approved by large majorities in the preliminary online vote, but they aren't actually formal policy yet, and hopefully they will become formal policy at the end of November. So, for example, we have a policy. There were two policies, actually, both very similar, on the question of tax reform, calling for steeply increased top marginal tax rates, income tax rates, calling for the imposition of a federal estate tax. We're the only G7 country that doesn't have a federal estate tax, calling for a wealth tax, calling for treating capital gains and income tax the same. Right now, we give much more preferential treatment to capital gains, which overwhelmingly favors the wealthy, because most Canadians don't have significant capital to invest. They're just kind of living paycheck from paycheck or close to it. And also, something I don't think any political party with seats in parliament has ever advocated for, a wealth cap. So an absolute limit on the accumulation of wealth. And I'd like to see that cap set at well below $1 billion. I think we should tax billionaires out of existence. The policy that we preliminarily approved doesn't actually specify a figure, but the mere fact that we have approved preliminarily the concept of capping wealth at an absolute limit, I think, is a very, very good thing. And another policy I'll mention is one that promotes democratization of the workplace. Because, we talk about having a democracy, but the place where we spend so much of our time, the workplace, is fundamentally anti-democratic. Okay, the people who are actually making the products and services are not deciding how to manage the business. They're not deciding what the work conditions are, where the business's resources are going to be allocated, how people are going to be compensated, what the benefits are going to be. These are people at the top of the organization who are completely unaccountable to the mass of the workers. And so if we want to have a real democracy, I think we have to democratize the workplace. And so we've adopted a policy which advocates for just doing that. So I think we're moving in the right direction. And hopefully, as I say, those policies will be formally adopted, and we'll have a leader, hopefully, who will be enthusiastic about advocating for them.
And just before we get into that leader who's on her way out, didn't the Greens also advocate, along with the NDP, making mental health care merge with a single payer system, as well as continuing to champion pharmacare?
We did continue to. I think we were the first party actually in Parliament to advocate for pharmacare. Whether I'm embarrassed to say, I'm not sure whether we took a position of merging mental health care into the single payer system, but I'm sure that we had a policy that was calling for strengthening mental health care in this country. But I can't, off the top of my head, tell you whether that we did that. As often happens with the Green Party of Canada, ideas that we propose end up being co-opted by others, which is a great thing. It's nice to see them being, adopted by the NDP and to a lesser extent by the Liberals. But I think that if that's the only function that we ever end up playing in Canadian politics is offering solutions that no one else is prepared to offer, then we'll still make an invaluable contribution.
Now, the past several months, the Greens the Green Party saw deep divisions regarding foreign policy, particularly on the issue of Palestine. What's your reflections regarding Annamie Paul's leadership, her allegations that she was subjected to racism? Do you think there's some truth to that, or do you think that most of the of the deep divisions in the Green Party stems down to how she dealt with the issue of Palestine. And if you want to explain people the whole background story around that, feel free to do that.
Well, let me first of all just respectfully part company with you on a premise of your question that there are deep divisions within the Green Party on this issue of Palestine.
Oh, okay.
I hear that a lot, and it's widely said in the mainstream press that there are deep divisions. But if you look at the history of our party's positioning on Palestine, it should be abundantly clear that there is overwhelming support for Palestinian human rights in the Green Party of Canada and for taking measures to ensure that Israel respects their human rights. So in 2016, we were the first party in the history of Canadian, first party in history having seats in Canada's parliament to adopt a policy calling for sanctions on Israel. That was ratified with over 90% support. Okay. Now in our party, we have a small number of people who remain pro-Israel, and they're so vocal and sometimes, frankly, so toxic that they can sometimes create the impression that they're more numerous than they already are, than they actually are. But when you look at the voting,
interesting that you say that. Yeah.
So what happened in the case of Annemie Paul really goes back to the leadership contest. You know, she was asked repeatedly, as were all the candidates. I was asked over and over again, what is my position with respect to the party's policy on Palestine? Because people were afraid, I think, and this was said to me, that I was going to reopen a debate about whether we should formally endorse the BDS movement. You know, and I told them, look, I'm very happy with the policy and I don't want to reopen that debate. We're calling for sanctions on Israel and it's a great policy. So I got asked all the time. Annemie got asked. And every time Annemie got asked, she essentially answered with, I support the policy. Well, she would never actually say she supported sanctions. And we got into a foreign policy debate organized by the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute about 6 weeks before the leadership contest concluded.
Yeah.
We were all asked about Palestine. She repeated what she had said earlier, that she supports the policy. And I had an opportunity to ask her a question about that. And what I said was, well, you say you support the policy, but do you actually support sanctions on Israel? Because that's part of our policy. And she said to me, quite surprisingly, because I'm the guy who negotiated the policy, that it doesn't endorse sanctions on Israel. And then when I pulled up the policy, I put it in the chat window of the Zoom call that we were all participating in and showed her that the policy expressly calls for sanctions on Israel. She claimed that that, in fact, was not party policy. So there was this unresolved question heading into Annemie Paul's leadership about where she really stood on Israel and Palestine. And I think it's fair to say, because of Israel's ongoing and worsening brutalization of the Palestinian people, that it was inevitable that this issue was going to come up again. And Annemie would be compelled, just as a practical matter, as the leader, to state unequivocally where she stood. So when the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque happened and the expulsions from Sheikh Jarrah, which do constitute ethnic cleansing, you know, the expulsion of Palestinians from a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, when this all happened in May, and then the bombardment of Gaza, which resulted in, you know, dozens of Palestinian children being killed again, at that moment, people, you know, called on the Green Party leader to endorse and support the policy, which had been ratified by over 90% of the members. But instead, she put out a statement which basically called for dialogue between the two sides and didn't recognize in any way, shape, or form that there was an oppressor and an oppressed, that the Israelis enjoy a massive power advantage over the Palestinians and use it to suppress their legitimate claims for their own state. And so this then elicited a reaction from two of our three MPs, one of whom called it, Jenica Atwin called Israel an apartheid state, which is true, it is an apartheid state. And the other of whom, Paul Manley, accused Israel of ethnic cleansing. At that point, Annemie Paul's senior advisor, a person by the name of Noah Zatzman, openly accused not just Paul Manley, our Green MPs, our own MPs, but also me of anti-Semitism because of the accusations we'd leveled against Israel.
I believe he also called Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the
correct
of the NDP,
an anti-Semite. Yes, and he continues to do that, by the way. He continues to accused Jagmeet Singh of being an anti-Semite on his Facebook page. And so amazing. I mean, it's just disgusting that you would call any of these people anti-Semites. But in any event, he did this, and rather than fire him, which would have been the appropriate thing to do, immediately fire him, suspend him, criticize him, disavow in some way the grave and unjustified accusations he'd leveled against people in his own party and against the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, Annie Paul remained silent for a period of 4 weeks. And then the inevitable, what I regard as the inevitable, happened. Jenica Atwin quit the caucus and joined another party. I think she made the mistake of going to the Liberals.
Exactly.
But she obviously felt very unwelcome in the Green Party caucus because the leader's office was smearing her and the leader was not acting to protect her. And this precipitated, a huge controversy in her party and led to calls for a no confidence vote in the leader. Now, there was a lot of other stuff going on. This was sort of the major catalyst to a no confidence vote. The attacks on our MPs that were not dealt with effectively by the leader. But prior to that time, people in the leader's inner circle had gone to the Toronto Star, a major Canadian newspaper, and were alleging that perhaps Annie Paul was encountering obstructionism because of race and misogyny. And since then, since the Zatzman affair, there have been other accusations of that nature leveled against the party by either Miss Paul or by people who are close to Miss Paul. Yeah. And in responding to your question, I'm going to, quote a friend of mine, someone for whom I have tremendous respect from the Black community in Toronto, who is a well-known figure in the anti-racism, anti-oppression movement. He's critical of Miss Paul. And actually two friends of mine from the Black community in Toronto, who have these, have an established record of.
Talk about Desmond Cole, or?
Well, I'm not going to identify them because I haven't been authorized to identify who they are. But if I were to mention their names, it would be recognized by a lot of Canadians. And they say, yeah, these people are very well respected in the anti-oppression, anti-racism movement. Okay. They're quite critical of Miss Paul, but they both said to me, and I think they're right, it would be a miracle if a Black woman did not encounter racism as a leader of a political party in Canada. It would be a miracle. And frankly, I don't believe in miracles, Youri. So there's so much racism in this country. It's so deeply ingrained in all of our political parties, not just the Green Party. Most of it unconscious racism, right? We're not even aware at times that we're acting in ways that are discriminatory. Then I think it's highly likely that Annie Paul actually had to deal with racism. I think it's a virtual certainty. The complexity for us is, as a party, is to disentangle legitimate criticism from racism. Mm-hmm. And that can be very difficult to do, right? Sometimes sometimes the racism isn't obvious on its face. There's a racist motive in the way somebody behaves, but the way the person is behaving may seem outwardly reasonable or legitimate. It's very hard to disentangle those two things. We have an obligation as a party to make our best efforts to do that, and to ensure to the maximum possible degree that we are a safe place for all racialized persons. Annie Paul, any person from a racialized community. We have to do a much better job of that. We have a lot of work to do. And, if I were to run to be the leader, and as I say, I don't know if I'm going to do that. For me, this would be a top priority.
Yes, and in fact, and I do have to say, because I got into a bit of a Twitter argument with with several people about about this controversy, which Yves Engler the past several months has has followed closely, and I keep saying to people that Dimitri Lascaris has repeatedly said that if that the Green Party should investigate whether Annie Paul's allegations of racism that was leveled against her is true. So that's that's important to say. So Thank before you. Are we out of time actually?
I've got a few more minutes, like 4 more minutes. If you have one more question.
Okay. Well, that leads to so answer this question very briefly before I get to this very last question, then, which is, you mentioned, will you run again, Dimitri? And if so, will you run again for the leadership of the of the Green Party of Canada? And yeah, well, answer that question before before I ask, follow up to that.
Yeah, so the short answer, in all sincerity, I'm not being coy, Youri. I really don't know. For
Okay.
me, first of all, there's no reason for me to make up my mind right now because the enemy actually is technically still the leader. And even after she's replaced by an interim leader, a leadership contest is not likely to begin until early next year. I think the first quarter of next year at the earliest.
Okay.
So it's such an important decision. I really see no reason for me or anybody to be rushing into making a decision. But ultimately, my uncertainty arises from the fact that I do have some reservations about electoral politics. And I have to make a decision about what is the best way that I can contribute to a resolution of the various crises that confront us. I'm 57 years old. I consider myself to have been very fortunate in my life. I'm now, after a successful legal career, I'm able to devote myself almost entirely to non-income earning activities like activism, not-for-profit journalism. And I feel like I have an obligation to give back because I've been so fortunate in my life. And I am a white man and of European origin, and that's conferred upon me certain privileges. So I just don't know what the best way for me to do that is. Is it to focus on activism? Is it to put more time and energy into journalism like you do? Or is it politics? And that's what I got to decide.
So then, very briefly, if it's even possible, if you were to enter a leadership race and and you don't win, but you still manage to get that second place, would you join the NDP, or would you be in favor that some on the left in Canada are flirting with this idea of merging the NDP with the Greens? And if so, and if you were in favor of that, what would it have to take? Like, would the NDP have to embrace ranked choice voting in order to in their selection of leaders, or what's your response?
Look, I have many friends in the NDP base. Many people I know who are longtime supporters of the NDP are truly committed to a left-wing agenda. They are real socialists, passionate socialists. But at the end of the day, the NDP is ruled by the leader and a few, very influential persons in the leader's inner circle. And the leader is not a socialist, and the leader is not even left-wing. The best that can be said about Jagmeet Singh is that he's moderately center left, and maybe that even is too generous. Arguably, he's just a straight up centrist. Now, is he to the left of Justin Trudeau?
I say that both he and Enemy Pod are diet liberals, is what I say.
I would say they're definitely, both of them, I would say, are either center or center left in their politics. They're clearly, I would say, more progressive than Justin Trudeau and Erin O'Toole, but that's not saying much because Justin Trudeau is right wing. Even though it's crazy. I see, left wing. The Guardian recently referred to the Trudeau Liberals as being leftist. I mean, it started laughing. So it's not easy to be to the left of them. So as long as the NDP is in the thralls of a neoliberal leadership that is fundamentally committed to the capitalist system and is unwilling to articulate a real critique of the capitalist system and offer a truly democratic and humane and just alternative to the capitalist system, there is no way in hell that I'm going to support the NDP. I'm not going to support any party that's led by people like that. I just can't. And so, in terms of a merger, no. I mean, in the current conditions, not at all. And if you look at what the NDP has done provincially when they've gained power, for example, in BC with John Horgan, and in Alberta with Rachel Notley, who is probably going to win the next election, how they've kowtowed to the extractive sector, to fossil fuels industry, how they've trampled upon Indigenous rights. No, I have no interest in merging with the NDP as it's currently constituted. Now, if the NDP was one day led by a true leftist and was truly pursuing the kind of agenda that I've described, then that's certainly something I would be open to. And, I think it would be great for us to unite the left in this country, because I think most Canadians lean to the left. But the conditions right now are not really conducive to that.
Before I get to this final question, what would you say to members of the NDP Socialist Caucus and / Socialist Action Canada? I know you've had many spirited debates with past guests on the program, Barry Weisletter. What would you say to them and other NDP Socialist Action, Socialist Caucus members who say, if you can't beat them, join them? So Dimitri, join us. We'll campaign for you to become a leader of the, of the NDP. Yeah, your response to NDP socialists like that.
I would say that they should join us. It's.
Oh boy, you guys are all playing hardball. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why.
Socialists and you NDP socialists.
But my argument is very simple, and I don't think they have an effective response, and that is, look, despite very considerable obstacles thrown at me by the right and by the establishment, I came very close to winning the leadership contest last year. I finished second. It went to the 8th and final ballot before a winner was declared, and I was actually ahead on the 5th ballot. So I came this close to winning on an explicitly eco-socialist platform. I can't think of anybody in my lifetime who was explicitly eco-socialist, certainly not in the last 20 years, who came that close to winning the leadership of the NDP.
Very fair arguments.
It's easier in our party because our party does have a more grassroots-oriented approach, for example, to policymaking, because it is a smaller party and because it has a less entrenched centrist leadership. It is easier to transform this party into an eco-socialist party than it is to transform the NDP into an eco-socialist party. So if I thought that was the easiest way to get there, I would support that, but I don't. I think the easiest way to get there is by supporting the Green Party of Canada and an eco-socialist leader of the Green Party of Canada.
My final question, Dimitri, because I've kept you over time and because we're under strict time, is and I've asked you this question before, and a fan of the program really wanted me to ask both you and Yves this is, Dimitri, where do you find your hope? Where do you get your optimism from? Because I know you actually are a very like Yves Engler, you're both very well-known optimists. So where do you find your hope, and where do you get your optimism from, given the dismal state of affairs, not just in Canada but globally, and of course, the sectarianism that we see on the left. What inspires you to keep doing what you're doing and to keep fighting the good fights?
When I'm feeling, I'm not always optimistic. I have to be candid with you about that, Youri. There are days where I'm in a very dark mood, and I look at what's happening in this world, and I have doubts.
Likewise.
I'm sure. And there was a poll done recently. It was just heartbreaking. A reputable polling agency polled young adults in something like 30 or 40 different countries across the world, and found that 56% of them believe that humanity is doomed. I mean, a majority of young adults believe humanity is doomed. That's how grim the situation is.
The climate crisis. I remember asking you that question, like, is there any hope for humanity given, the climate crisis and what the activists on Democracy Now! Said about, scientists say we're past the point of no return. Scientists are apparently self-censoring their findings, and I remember that, I remember asking you, where's the hope in all of this, which is why I asked you that question even now.
Well, when I get that way, what I do is, first thing I do is I get myself to a protest. Because when I get down in the streets and I see myself surrounded by thousands of people who are demanding solutions, who are demanding justice, who are demanding fairness and democratic rights, then I realize that we outnumber the opposition. I'm reminded about that, and some of the relationships I've struck up. Like, I remember I took part in something called it was an event on Wall Street back in 2016 during the People's Climate March, where it was basically an act of civil disobedience, and we were all sitting on Wall Street blocking the street for an entire day. And some of the relationships I struck up with people just sitting there on the street during that, talking to them, they were wonderful people. incredible. People who were, who were comfortable in their lives, really didn't have any immediate concerns as to their own well-being, but were so motivated to contribute in some way to a solution of the crises confronting us that they got out of their safety zone, went down in the streets, and were risking arrest by the New York police. And when I see that, my strong belief, not just hope, but my strong belief that we will ultimately prevail is resuscitated and invigorated, and that's where I get my optimism from. And
on that very optimistic notes, very upbeat notes. Unfortunately, folks, Dimitri's a very busy man and he has to go, so I'm going to let him go. So, Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of 1+1, celebrating 1+1, reaching 100 episodes. Thank you so much for all the times you've been on the program. I wish you the best of luck in all you do. I hope that that you do consider running for the leadership of the Green Party, and I'll definitely be in touch, and I'll definitely be in touch with you about that. And again, thanks for all that you do. And so this to Yves Engler. Now, a lot of times when I see you and Yves, and you're both very much compassionate gentlemen, you guys know how to direct your anger at the very powerful and trying to unite people. That gives me a lot of optimism. So anyways,
thank you. Congratulations again, Youri. Keep up the great work. Keep
doing what you're doing, and best of luck to everything. And we hope to have you back on the program in the future.
Okay. Take care.
Ciao till then.
Ciao. Bye-bye.